Hi.
Okay, hi, how are you? I was trying to unmute and it was giving me problems. I just wanted to say hi.
Problem. So, just Patty and you, but hopefully more people will join in a few minutes. Hola, Pablo.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
No te veo.
Dame ver, no, tengo la pantalla al revés, a ver, la camarita. Ahí estamos.
Ahora sí. ¿Cómo estás?
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy bien, bien, gracias. Contento acá de estar participando en esto.
Genial.
Y
We have Yes.
voy a entrar también con mi computadora, porque ahora estoy acá con el teléfono para usar la cámara, pero voy a entrar con la computadora para compartir ahí un PowerPoint.
Bueno,
Así que
pero creo que te vas a tener que borrar de alguna porque duplicado me parece que hay un sonido que se...
A ver, probamos, a ver,
Bueno.
entro de entrar con...
Se superpone y...
Sí, entiendo. Bueno, probamos y si no me desconecto
Bueno.
con el teléfono. Ahí estoy esperando que me aprueben. En todo caso, yo le anulo el audio acá en la computadora. Bueno, ahí estoy con los dos.
Okay.
¿Se escucha bien, no?
Yes. So we are 9. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. This will be our last session of presentations. The last meeting will be on June 7th, right before your trip. But today we're having Pablo Comelatto. Although not a Fulbright alum, Pablo studied in US. He holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He's an economist and a demographer. And he studies the economic impact of demographic events. He's a professor at several universities, the University of Buenos Aires, his alma mater, and the University of Luján. And he has also taught at other universities in Argentina. So welcome, Pablo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me. I'm going to be talking. Let me share my screen with you all. Let's see, share screen. Okay, so you have to give me permission to share the screen. Now? I can't hear you.
I gave you permission already to share your screen.
Okay. What?
You are the
It should
host
be the.
now. You are
Okay.
the
Are you? Okay. Let me get. Let me log out from this camera here,
Okay.
and let's go to the other user.
Okay. Just a moment.
Okay. A ver ahora. Ok, todavía no.
Estás en 12 pantallas.
A ver ahora.
A ver, ahora fíjate.
Ahí está, ahí está. Sorry about that. Okay, how about now? Can you see my
Yeah.
screen?
We can see your slides.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'll be talking about the demography of Argentina, and to motivate this presentation, let me share with you this quote by Cassels and Miller, a classical book about migration. And well, you can see there, they say areas such as the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or Argentina are considered classical countries of immigration. Their populations consist mainly of European immigrants and their descendants. The aboriginal populations have been partially destroyed and dispossessed. Today, the survivors have a marginal and discriminated existence. Okay, so this is quite a quote, right? And it reflects, well, some realities about the past and present of Argentina, and also some perceptions that might be sometimes somewhat distorted about the origin and the composition of the population of Argentina in the past and in the present. Well, when I say perceptions and ideas about Argentina, this classical idea about Argentina, particularly Buenos Aires, being like the Paris of South America, or being a mostly European country. I don't know, well, people, you are visiting here, the city. I don't know what your idea is, what your perception is, but this is a general idea that many people share, many people from Argentina, and also people from abroad. So So let's see. This is data from 2010. The last census for which we have complete data. I'm going to talk in a minute about the present. But this shows the composition of the population, and you see we have mostly. Let me see if I have the pointer. Okay, so can you see the pointer there? Okay. You're listening to me, right?
Sí, sí, la vemos.
Oh, okay, perfecto. Okay, so here we have 95.5% of the population was native born, 4.5% was foreign born, and overlapping with those classifications, we have 2.4% that describe themselves as being of indigenous descent, and a small percentage, 0.4 of, well, what we call here Afrodescendiente. I should mention for people from the US, we don't have a question here, and we don't collect statistics by race so the way we talk about race and ethnic composition, well, it's different than you do in the United States. But only recently we began asking about, well, population of being, let's say, Afro-Argentinian, or people who describe themselves as having a African descent. And well, there's only a small percentage of that, only 0.4. So mostly what we have is native born population, relatively small percentage of foreign born, and even smaller percentage of people who describe themselves as either indigenous or Afrodescendiente. Okay, so this is 2010. Now, to have an idea how we got here to this population composition, we are going to take a look at census data. Okay, so these are the census years in the past, what we usually call the old censuses. You see, going back to 1869, that was more or less the beginnings of modern Argentina, and that's when we collected the first census. And then beginning in 1960, we have what we usually call the modern censuses, beginning with United Nations recommendations about how to conduct a census. You see, we begin with the census is the years and every new decade, 60s, 70, 80, 91, we were almost there. And now in this century, 2001, 2010, 2022, and in fact 2022, that happened to be 2 weeks ago. Okay, so I don't know if you were here 2 weeks ago, but well, so precisely, well, 2 weeks yesterday, that was the census day. So we'll take a look at census data over this whole period of time and see what image we get from the country and how the country has been evolving over this time. So let me switch to a different. Okay, here we have. Okay, so this is census data going back, as I mentioned, to 1869. Here you can see the population pyramid. Green here, the female population, this purple, I think this is purple. This is for the male population. The darker purple and darker green reflects native-born population, while the light purple and light green reflects foreign-born. Okay, so going back to 1869, you see, well, there was a number of foreign-born population that were registered in the census. Now, if we move forward to the next censuses, you see 1895, 1914. So let's stop there, 1914. Probably what you see here, I mean, the thing that I think we should mention here is that the increase in the number of foreign-born people in the country, particularly male. You can think this is the late 19th century. Something more or less similar happened in the US, where there was a lot of migration, mostly from Europe, mostly from, well, in the case of the US, it was mostly from Northern and Western Europe. Argentina, it was mostly Southern Europe. But around that time, about 30% of the population was foreign-born. Okay, think about that. One out of every three people in the country were foreign-born. And that was even more here in the city, here in Buenos Aires. Of course, this is whole. This is national data, or this pyramid that we are looking at now. But in the city of Buenos Aires, more than 50% of the male population were foreign-born. Okay, so think about how that affected the composition of the population. And that's the origin of this idea of the population of the country being mostly from European descent, and Buenos Aires being the Paris of South America. Okay. Now, if we move forward to the next censuses, well, one thing that we notice is the decline in the percentage of foreign-born population. Even more, 1960, 70, 80, 91, 2001, 2010. This data series goes only until 2010. Well, as you imagine, we finished collecting the census, the 2022 census only 2 weeks ago, so we still don't have data for that, even though we have a preliminary number for the total population, but we don't know about age composition, which is what we are looking at here in the pyramid. So compare, let's go back to 1914. And let's switch between 1914 and 2010. So we see that the population, the pyramid changes its shape. One thing that is, I don't know how used you are to looking at population pyramids, but we also see here, other than the change in composition in terms of migration status, we also see we have an aging population. We see the decline in the number of children at the base of the pyramid, and increasing numbers in the middle and older ages. Okay, so that's a trend, a population that is aging. That's a trend that it's that we observe in Argentina, and we should say, as in many other countries in Latin America, but of course the United States, Western Europe, many Asian countries. So population aging is probably the biggest issue in population change for the 21st century, for the late 20th and for all of the 21st century. And Argentina is part of this trend. And we pick up some of that in these population pyramids. Now, going back to migration. Now, let's be more specific about migration. So what we see here is the proportion of foreign-born population. Again, we have the censuses years here. And this is the 30% that I mentioned before in 1914. So you see between 1869, the year of the first census, and 1914, the increasing proportion of foreign-born population in the country. This is the period of the when Argentina received these large flows of European immigration. In absolute numbers, of course, the United States received more immigrants than Argentina. The United States is, well, it's a bigger country, larger population. But in relative terms, Argentina at that time was an exceptional case in terms of how big this migration flow was relative to the population size of the country at that time. Okay, so in terms of, in terms of the history of migration movements, Argentina in the last two decades of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th century, really stands out as an exceptional case. Now, beginning at that time, after that, we have a descending proportion of foreign-born population. You see the trend is very, very steady until very recently, 2001, well, 2010. Now we are in the order of 4.2, 4.5%, and that's the last number that we have. Well, we will have to wait for a few more months until we have data from the last census, but we don't expect to have big changes in this number. So we could say, if we remember the quote that I showed you at the beginning, well, Argentina is a classical immigration country. Well, used to be effectively. Migration definitely was a large force shaping the population of the country. Now, is the origin of Argentina's population mostly European? Well, that's a more debatable question, okay? Now, according to a serious estimate that was made a few years ago, but it's still relevant, about, well, let me put it this way. Without migration, without European migration in the 19th century, the estimates for Argentina's population today would be more or less about half of what we actually have, okay? So right now we are, well, the census data for this number that we estimated a couple of weeks ago is about 47 million people for the whole country. So based on this estimate that I mentioned, well, without European immigration, well, we would be something in the order of 20-something, 22, 23, 25 million people in the country. So definitely those large flows of European immigration definitely shaped the country, which is not the same as saying that Argentina's population is mostly from European descent, okay? So I think there is some exaggeration there. Also, there has been some, well, you could say, attempts to emphasize the European origin of the population, and sometimes to hide other origins or the mixing between the different groups, native population or indigenous population before migration began. So I think that this idea of the country being an essentially European population, I think that's an overstatement. Now, if we look at the national origin of the immigrant population, of the foreign-born, beginning again in 1869, you see, well, this bar here represents the origin of the population. So you see this green section here is population or immigrants from Europe, European immigrants, which comprise almost 80%, and you see the percentages here, almost 80% of all of the foreign-born population at that time, again, 1869. So almost 80% from Europe, and well, slightly less than 20% from the rest of South America. Actually, the Americas, but essentially the rest of South America. Okay, there's very little migration from Central America, and even less from North America. So when we say the Americas, it's mostly South America. Now, if we move forward to 1914, this trend is even starker. You see, well, now we have almost 90% of all immigrants registered in the 1914 census. Almost 90% are from Europe, something slightly more than 10% from the Americas, and we have a more small residual percentage there for the rest of the world. Okay, so 90% of immigrants from Europe in 1914. Now, if we move forward to the next censuses, let's look at the proportion of European, and we see the decline, 1980, 1991, 2001, and 2010, and that's the last data point that we have. And you see the big change in the composition. Now less than 20% are European immigrants, and almost well, almost 80 or slightly less than 80 are from the Americas. And we should say, when I say the Americas, it's actually not even all of South America. It's mostly the neighboring countries. Okay, the 5 neighboring countries that we have, plus Peru. Peru is not a neighboring country, but it's close enough, both geographically and culturally, so that migration from Peru it's also important. Of course, neighboring countries, well, they just have to cross one border to be here, and that's the origin of most of the immigrants that we have right now. Okay, so this is about census data. Let me go back to the slides. What do we know right now? Well, again, we don't have data for the last census, but this is an estimate. But the International Organization for Migrations, that's an organization from the United Nations. They have data estimates for migrants, in this case for 2020. And you see, well, this is what we have to look at. Migrants in millions. The blue bars, this is immigrants. The red bars, this is immigrants, people living in the countries, in Latin America and the Caribbean. But let's look at the blue bar, and we see that Argentina is still today among the Latin American countries, the country that has the largest absolute number of immigrants. Okay? So close to 2 million, slightly less than 2 million people. That's more than, well, the next country, that would be Colombia, or even a large country as Brazil. You know, Brazil is 5 times as large in terms of population, 5 times as large as Argentina, but still Brazil receives less immigrants than Argentina. Okay, so what do we see here? A number, or actually a proportion of immigrants that has been declining. We saw the numbers there, going from something like 30% in 1914 to something like 4.5% in 2010. So big decline, but still Argentina is, in terms of absolute numbers, Argentina is the largest recipient of immigrants in Latin America. So this is, well, this is again 2010 census data. This is the national origin of all of the foreign-born population. This is the 1.8. I said less than 2 million. Well, this is the actual number. 1.8 million people foreign-born living in Argentina. That's the 4.5% that I mentioned. And this is the national origin of those foreign-born people. And you see about 50% of all of them are either from Paraguay or from Bolivia. Okay, so if you meet a random person here in Argentina and he or she happens to be foreign-born, well, there's a 50% chance that he or she is going to be either from Paraguay or Bolivia. Of course, to neighboring countries, okay, to the north of the country. Next is Chile. Chile's special case that I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. I want to say something particular about Chile. Peru, that, as I mentioned before, is not a neighboring country, but, well, it's close enough. Then comes Italy. You see Italy, Italy, the first European country, which, well, used to be the first sending country of immigrants to Argentina in the early 20th century. Well, now you see it ranks what, 5th in this list. Uruguay in 6th, only 6% of the total number of immigrants. Now you should consider Uruguay our next door neighbor, right here, the other side of the Rio de la Plata. You should keep in mind Uruguay is a small country, something like 3.3 or 3.4 million people. So this number of people of Uruguay living in Argentina amounts to something like 3% of the total population of Uruguay, okay, which is not a small number in relative terms for Uruguay, okay. Now you might, well, and then we have Spain, which is, well, more or less equivalent to Italy in terms of the timing of those migrants. I'm going to say something about that in a minute. Now you might be wondering where is, I mean, I said Chile is a special case that I want to mention something about Chile. Well, there is another special case in South America right now in terms of migration. And that country, you might know, that country is, of course, Venezuela, right? What has been going on in Venezuela in the last decade or so is very significant. It has had a big impact in the rest of the South American countries. So if I go back to this previous slide, here you see big red bar here in the case of Venezuela makes Venezuela the largest sending country of migrants in the region, well, only topped by Mexico. And of course, you know, most of those Mexican migrants are in the US, of course. But Mexico is also a larger country, larger than Venezuela. Mexico has more than 100 million people. Venezuela is smaller, it's just less than 30 million people. So this absolute number of migrants from Venezuela, it's really staggering. It's been the big issue in terms of migration, regional migration in South America recently. And that precisely is what makes Colombia the second largest receiver of migrants in Latin America. Remember I said Argentina was in first and Colombia was in second. Well, Colombia has not been traditionally a receiving country, but only very recently, Colombia has been the biggest recipient of Venezuelan migrants. Of course, they are neighboring countries, so many people from Venezuela crossing the border and going to Colombia. And in fact, you can see migrants, Venezuelan migrants in all of South America, even here in Buenos Aires, even though we are not very close to the distance from Buenos Aires to Venezuela is very large, but I don't know if you can pick up Latin American accents, how good you are in that, but well, we can tell when we hear Venezuelans talking, though, they have a particular accent. I particularly like it a lot. So that has been a recent development for the last 5, 6, 8 years. That's why the 2010 data doesn't register the number of Venezuelans. Okay, so that's something that we are going to learn when we have data for the present census. Okay. Okay, so what do we have here? This is the proportion of people ages 65 and over. Okay, this is a common indicator that we use as trends in population aging, the percentage of population over 65 years of age. In this case, only, well, actually for the native population, native-born population, for immigrants born in the Americas, in Europe, and the rest of the world. So this 10% is more or less the aging process of Argentina that I mentioned before when we were looking at the population pyramids. So about 10% of the native-born population in Argentina is 65 and over. 12% of immigrants from the Americas, and well, 65% of European immigrants. So this big number, this big jump here from 10 or 12% to 65%, that reflects not necessarily population aging, but the timing of the migration from Europe, okay? So large-scale European migration stopped in Argentina around 1945, 1950. In the immediate post-World War II period, there was a flow, that the last significant flow of immigration from Europe. So, so those people now are aging here in Argentina, and that's why you can see here, this is a consequence of the timing of the population. And so it's not surprise that most of the migrants from the Americas are relatively young because they are mostly recent migrants, okay? And also reflects that, well, we are not receiving younger immigrants from Europe. We have not been receiving young immigrants from Europe in the last, well, 50 or 60 years, okay? So these numbers that you see here, more than a reflection of population aging, what they reflect is the timing of the immigration process. Okay, so this is for the whole, well, 70 years from 1950 to 2020. This is data from the United Nations Population Prospects. And what we have here is the net migration rates for a number of South American countries, plus Mexico, plus the US. I put the United States here to have a reference, data that, of course, you know quite well. Just as a reference, okay? But what we see here is that only among these countries, only Argentina and Brazil are net recipients of immigrants, okay? While the rest of South America and Mexico too are net sending countries. On the net, they are sending more people than they are receiving, okay? So again, Argentina, even though nothing compares to the place that Argentina had in the early 20th century, Argentina is still a recipient of immigrants with a different origin, of course, and stands out in the context of Latin America as a net recipient of immigrants. Now, I said that I wanted to say a couple of things about Chile and Venezuela. So in this case, this graph is particularly for Chile and Venezuela. Let me go back a second. We see that Chile on net, the net for the last, for this whole 70 years is negative. So looking at this, you could think, okay, well, Chile is also sending people abroad, and same thing for Venezuela. But actually, the timing is very different. So let's look first at Chile. So what we see is that from 1950 until 1990, Chile had negative net migration. Okay, so again, Chile was sending more people abroad than they were receiving. Okay, so net migration was negative. 1990, you might know or not, but that's the end of the dictatorship in Chile. So that's begun a new era in Chile, both in terms of political freedoms, but also of economic development. So as of recently, Chile has become a net receiver of immigrants. So you see, quite now, the situation in Chile is very different than what it used to be 40, 50, 60 years ago. Okay, so Chile, I don't know if you've had the chance to visit Chile, but definitely, well, the economic development and political freedoms that the country has enjoyed in the last 30 years, well, has made the country very attractive for immigrants. So when I said before, okay, on the whole, for the whole 70 years, Chile has had a negative balance. Well, that doesn't apply to the last 30 years, okay? So it's the balance of the whole 70, but the last 30, the picture is quite different. And the opposite can be said for Venezuela, okay? In the past, Venezuela used to be a country receiving migrants. You see the red bars here. This is the positive balance for Venezuela receiving migrants. Many of them were from Colombia, precisely, but now the flow reversed. Instead of people from Colombia going to Venezuela, we have the opposite. And you see, well, this this number is quite, I mean, this is very significant. Having, well, in this case, is a migration rate per 1,000. So this is 20, or slightly more than 20 per 1,000 population, members of the population. 20 people are migrating just in the last, these five years from 2015 to 2020, okay? So this is important to consider the regional dynamics of population. Okay, so what we have here is the total population of all 10 South American countries plus Mexico. So, well, of course, the population of the region is has been increasing quite a lot. There has been relatively fast population growth in the region in the last 70 years. Argentina too, down here, the blue bars down here, this is Argentina, and the population of Argentina, again, has been growing too. But if we look at the relative terms, this is the same numbers, but in relative terms, and again, this is Argentina down here. Actually, you see that the proportion or the relative size of Argentina in the context of the region has been declining. Let me put this, I think this is a better way to show the same thing, okay? This line here, what is showing is Argentina's population as a fraction of the population of the whole region. So you see we've been going down from slightly less than 13% to slightly more than 8%. Okay, so Argentina, even though Argentina's population has been growing, in relative terms, we are growing less than the rest of the region. And again, even though we receive migrants from the rest of the region and from the other countries. So what's going on with the population of the country, that even though we receive migrants, not a lot, but we receive some migrants from the rest of the countries, the relative size of the population has been declining. And that has to do with fertility rates. What we have here is the total fertility rate. This is the most usual way to present fertility data. The number here, the numbers that we observe here on the left, this is the average number of children per woman. Okay, so it's a number that it's very intuitive. We can think about it, and we can understand what we are looking at. Okay, so I chose here Brazil as a comparison. Okay, the blue line is Argentina, the red one is Brazil. So the first thing, significant thing, is the big difference in total fertility rates between the big difference between Brazil and Argentina. In the early second half of the 20th century, the 1950s and 60s, and even 70s, you see fertility rates in Brazil were much, much higher than Argentina's, okay? So in fact, Brazil was having around 6 children per woman. Think about that number. On average, every Brazilian woman was having 6 children over the course of her lifetime. And at the same time, a woman in Argentina was having around 3, half of the Brazilian number. And if we had more countries here, actually, I think I have it. Yeah. So I have here, again, Brazil, plus Colombia, Mexico. So you see, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, they all had in the 1950s and 60s around 6 or even more children per woman, okay? While Argentina and Uruguay, the blue and green line are Argentina and Uruguay, were in the order of 3. Uruguay actually even lower than Argentina. And again, the orange line is the United States to have as a reference, okay? So what you have here for the US, 1950s and 60s, that's the baby boom, right? If we went back to the 1940s, it will be even more clear. But well, of course, you know about the baby boomers in the US, and we can see that in the this relatively high total fertility rate for the US at that time, higher than Argentina's and Uruguay, for example, okay? And then this is the end of the baby boom in the US, right? But again, going back to Argentina and Brazil, so this big difference explains why Argentina's relative size in the context of Latin America has been declining, okay? Because in Argentina, Argentinian women were having less children than Brazilian, Colombian, Venezuelan, Ecuadorian, well, you name it. The rest of the countries in the region, they were all having, in relative terms, they were all having more children than Argentinian women, okay? And that, well, some people think, well, I think that that's a reasonable assumption, that the reason for this is precisely the consequences of the old, by that time, old European migration, okay? So when the European immigrants came to the country, they brought here fertility patterns typical from Europe, which were lower than Latin American countries, patterns of fertility. So the fertility in Argentina, also Uruguay, which also received, in relative terms, Uruguay also received a lot of immigrants from Europe. So fertility in Argentina and Uruguay reflects the influence of European migration. Now, more recently, fertility in the other Latin American countries has been declining quite fast. You see Brazil here going down, and in fact, in the 1990s, fertility rates in Brazil, at that time they crossed Argentina's, and now Brazil has lower fertility than Argentina. And same thing goes, you see again, well, here you have Colombia, here you have Mexico, also with very, very fast declining fertility rates. And nowadays, in fact, you could say that Argentina's fertility rate, it's not so low. In the context of Latin America, Argentina's fertility rate is not that low as compared to the other Latin American countries, okay? So there was this big decline in fertility in the other Latin American countries so fast that now Argentina's fertility is not that low, at least until we have new official numbers. And again, we need census data for that. So hopefully in the next few months, we are going to have updated data for fertility numbers, among other things. Okay, so to conclude, this is my last slide. This is, again, the proportion of population aged 65 or over. Again, here we have the United States as a reference. For the US, we have 16.6% of the population. This is for 2020. I'm sorry that it's not here in the table, but this is for 2020. 16% of the population is 65 and over. The United States is aging, as I mentioned before. The population aging is a process that affects most countries in the world, and the US, of course, is not exception. Then we have Uruguay, again, as a consequence of very low fertility, is the first among Latin American countries with 15%, then Chile, and then Argentina. Okay, so population aging is one of the big issues right now, again, for all of the world, but Argentina is not exception there. Okay, so a couple of questions, actually. This is, let me finish with this. Some concerns for the future. Periodic economic crisis. I don't know if you've talked about this, but we have recurrent economic crisis here in Argentina. We had a big one in 2001. Right now, while you could say we are, of course, right now, things are all affected by the pandemic, but the economy of the country is very turbulent. We have high inflation, there's always the question about how that affects population trends. There is some concern that there might be some out-migration going on right now. We still don't have data for that, but as a consequence of the economic crisis, there might be some level of out-migration, which wouldn't be the first time. Again, as I said, 2001, we had a big economic crisis, and as a consequence, there was migration, out-migration of people from Argentina going abroad. And finally, population aging. What's going to happen in the next few decades? As we saw before, apparently fertility is not going down so fast in Argentina as in other Latin American countries, so it might be that population aging doesn't happen so fast. And in any event, how are we going to deal with population aging? Now we have to look at the experiences of other countries, among them the US, of course, but taking into account that the US or Western Europe are wealthy countries, they are rich countries that are aging, while Argentina and the other Latin American countries, we are not so rich, but we are also aging. So there is this saying about, trying to become richer before we become older. So that's probably one of the concerns about the near future. Okay, so this is the panorama of Argentina's population. I hope you found it interesting, and if you have questions, I'm all ears.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Very informative. Now, okay. Very informative presentation about demographics and the history of migration into Argentina. I don't know if the projects of the participants are connected to Argentina's demographics, but if this is the case, you have the possibility of asking Pablo, as he's a real specialist on this topic.
I have a question. Could I ask a question?
Of course.
What are Argentina's immigration policies? How, I know that there's been a shift from having a lot of European immigrants to having a lot of immigrants from bordering nations. What are the policies of Argentina surrounding immigration? Okay,
that's a great question. Didn't have time to talk about that, but effectively, there was a big shift in migration policies going back to the 1860s. Remember, I mentioned that was the origin of modern Argentina. There was the time when the national government began to organize and implement population policies, and at that time there was a very I'm trying to think the right word. Let's say evident. That's not the word I'm trying to say, but a very open policy of promoting European immigration. In fact, our founding fathers at that time, they were very, very vocal and very specific about trying to promote European immigration, but not any other kind of immigration, right? In ways that we would call today racist policies, right? They were not seen as racist at the time. So that policy lasted until about the 1960s. And in the 1960s, the government recognized that the patterns of migration were changing. So at that time, they began to implement some restrictions to immigration, recognizing that, well, European people, they didn't want to migrate to Argentina anymore, and it was mostly people from the neighboring countries that the government at that time implemented restriction policies. Particularly, well, we have a dictatorship of our own. I mentioned Chile's, but we have ours in the 1970s. There was even some attempts to expel migrants from neighboring countries. Now that changed more recently. I think it was 2010, a new policy was implemented. It's called the Patria Grande. Patria Grande is the name that we used to refer to Latin America as the whole fatherland for all of Latin Americans. So the beginning in the 2010s, more or less, I wouldn't say that we have an open border policy, but the government began trying to regularize the situation of immigrants from bordering countries, to a point that you could say that right now there are no illegal immigrants in Argentina. And what do I mean by that? It's very easy for any immigrant to regularize his or her situation. So there wouldn't be need for an immigrant to be in an illegal or a irregular situation, because it's relatively easy to have a legal status in the country. Okay, so again, I don't know if I would call it open borders policy, but it's relatively welcoming to immigrants from the neighboring countries. And thanks for the question. It was really, I mean, I had a few slides about that, but it's definitely, there has been a change in the policies from the country.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Hi, I was just wondering, I read the brown text that you sent us, which I thought was really helpful in reading about immigration. And I drew so many parallels to, I teach in New York City, so we spent a lot of time talking about Ellis Island and the European immigrants and such. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the experiences of the immigrants at that time in terms of like assimilation or nativist attitudes, or how they were treated, and a little bit about that, or where I could find maybe some sources to look it up for my capstone.
Right. Okay, so as I said, the official policy at that time was to welcome European immigrants. Okay, so so there was no, you could say, open discrimination against European immigrants. Now, according to the original plans of our, as I call them, our founding fathers, that was the generation of political leaders at that time, when well, they were organizing the national government and the territory of the country. The original plan was that these immigrants should settle in the provinces mostly, okay, to occupy the territory. Argentina at that time, well, in 1869, the population size was only 1.8 or 1.9 million people for this large territory. Large part of the country was not occupied. The national government didn't have effective control over those areas, particularly Patagonia, you know, Patagonia, the southern part of the country. So the plan was that these European immigrants should settle in those areas, colonize those territories, but the plan didn't go quite that way. Actually, there was a number of immigrant colonies in some of the provinces, particularly Santa Fe. I don't know if you know some of the provinces, but the province of Santa Fe, Córdoba, Entre Rios. Okay, so those are some of the, particularly Santa Fe and Córdoba are the two next largest provinces after Buenos Aires. Now, the thing is, most of the immigrants, they settle in Buenos Aires, here in the city. And as I said, in 1914, about 50% of the population in the city were immigrants. So I think the attitudes in general was that they assimilated really fast, and actually they influenced quite a lot the culture of the city in particular. Okay, so in a way you could say that the natives assimilated to the immigrants instead of the other way around. Okay, now the thing is completely different towards immigrants from the neighboring countries. Okay, so there's a lot of discrimination against them. This idea of Argentina being a country of European descent, well, tends to precisely deny the importance of immigration from the neighboring countries, and discrimination against them is definitely an issue, even though most of the people wouldn't recognize that, of course, but that's an issue today. Now, I mentioned that the Paraguayan and Bolivian communities are quite large. They are they are practically 50% of all of the foreign-born population. So they have their own networks. They have the networks that support their members. There's a lot of return migration. Actually, sometimes people from Paraguay and from Bolivia, they spend some time here in Buenos Aires, then they go back to Paraguay and back again to Buenos Aires. They have these support networks. For a new immigrant, it's relatively easy, to assimilate, but in a way, to assimilate with the help of his or her own community, and not necessarily assimilate to the larger population. Okay. Okay, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
One last question.
Yes, I have a question, Pablo.
Yes.
So what type of jobs these different groups of immigrants what do they do?
Okay. Well, migrants from the neighboring countries, if we look at the education level, it's usually lower than the average native born population. So they usually have specific jobs in construction, domestic service, some personal services. That has changed somewhat with more recent, for example, the Venezuelan migration, which tends to be more skilled than the typical migrant from the neighboring country. And that reflects, of course, the situation in Venezuela, where, highly educated people are the ones that are having the highest migration rates from Venezuela. So that has been a big change in terms of the skills of the immigrant population. Now, for the Venezuelans, they have some trouble trying to validate their diplomas here in Argentina. So even though they are highly skilled, they not necessarily are able to take advantage of those skills here in the country. So they have to settle for lower skill occupations. And in the past, well, of course, the European immigrants, even though education levels at the time were lower than now, usually, well, they have specific skills that they brought here, and they were valued because of that, right? Also, other than, well, the ethnic or racial connotations, the European immigrants were valued because they had specific skills that were not present here in the labor force in the country.
Okay. We should be finishing this presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it. And we thank Pablo very much for his enlightening presentation.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Okay.
For the rest of you, you will be receiving a reminder soon for the next meeting on June 7th, I guess, but you'll be receiving an email with all the required information. So thanks very much for attending today. See you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.